When people think about the fall of Rome, what image comes to mind? Maybe you imagine wild barbarian warriors storming the gates of the eternal city, or perhaps legions breaking apart on the battlefield. Some picture emperors poisoned in their marble palaces, betrayed by those closest to them. These are dramatic scenes, and yes, they all played a role. But here's the truth. Empires don't collapse only because of enemies at the door. They crumble from within. And when it comes to self-destruction, few forces are as corrosive as money. Or rather, the loss of trust in money. Rome didn't fall simply because of invasions, political corruption, or decadent emperors. It fell because the foundation of its economy, its currency, collapsed. And the lessons from that collapse are as relevant today as they were nearly 2,000 years ago. Let's rewind and set the stage. For centuries, the backbone of the Roman economy was a single coin, the silver denarius. First minted around the year 201 before Christ, the denarius was almost pure silver. That made it reliable, stable, and respected not only across the Roman Empire but even beyond its borders. Soldiers were paid with it. Merchants demanded it. Families stored their wealth in it. The denarius wasn't just metal, it was confidence stamped into a coin. As long as people believed in Rome, they believed in the denarius. The empire's power and its currency were two sides of the same coin, literally. But here's the problem. Running an empire is expensive. Rome wasn't just one city. It was a sprawling machine stretching from the deserts of North Africa to the icy frontiers of Britain, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle East. Legions had to be paid. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts had to be built. Temples, forums, and amphitheaters had to be maintained. And wars. Rome was almost always at war, drained the treasury faster than gold could flow in. By the 2nd century after Christ, the empire was stretched thin. On the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes pressed against the borders. In the east, the Parthians and later the Persians were constant threats. Inside the empire, revolts and unrest demanded costly campaigns. Tax revenues couldn't keep up. So what did the emperors do? They turned to an ancient trick: debasement. Debasement meant lowering the silver content in coins. Instead of raising taxes, which always sparked anger among the people, emperors tried to quietly cheat the system. A denarius would look the same size, same stamp of authority, but underneath, it contained less and less real silver. The numbers tell the story. Under Augustus, Rome's first emperor at the dawn of the empire, the denarius contained about 95% silver. 2 centuries later, under Emperor Caracalla, that percentage had already dropped to about 50%. And by the mid-3rd century, under Emperor Gallienus, the silver content was under 5%. A once solid coin had become a bronze disc with only a thin silver wash. The people weren't fooled. They could see the difference. They could feel the difference. And soon, the economy itself felt the difference too. The result of this debasement was inflation, one of the oldest and most devastating economic diseases in human history. Prices began to soar because money was no longer anchored to real value. Think about it. A measure of wheat that once cost a single denarius might suddenly cost 5, 10, or even 20. And this wasn't some abstract economic theory. This was daily life for ordinary Romans. Imagine being a farmer in the countryside or a shopkeeper in the busy markets of Rome. The coins in your hand looked official, stamped with the emperor's image, but they didn't buy what they used to. Soldiers who relied on their pay to feed their families demanded higher wages just to survive. Merchants stopped trusting the debased coins altogether, preferring barter or direct payments in gold and goods. Local economies reverted to trade by necessity because the currency had lost its trust. This created a vicious cycle. As confidence in the currency dropped, emperors minted even more of the cheapened coins, hoping that sheer volume could replace real value. But the more they produced, the faster inflation spiraled out of control. It's a cycle we've seen repeated across history, from ancient Rome to modern hyperinflations. The crisis peaked in what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between the years 235 and 284 after Christ, the Roman Empire endured nearly 50 years of chaos. It was a nightmare. Constant invasions, devastating plagues, brutal civil wars, and underneath it all, complete economic collapse. Emperors rose and fell at dizzying speed. Some ruled for just a few months before being assassinated or overthrown. Behind the palace intrigue and the battlefield defeats lay one unifying reality: the financial system was broken. Taxes were demanded in coins that were practically worthless. Farmers abandoned their land rather than pay impossible levies. Trade networks that had once spanned continents fractured into isolated pockets. To keep the economy afloat, the Roman government tried desperate measures: strict price controls, forced labor obligations, and even confiscations. None of it worked. One emperor, Diocletian, tried to stop the bleeding with radical action. In the year 301 after Christ, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. It attempted to fix the cost of more than 1,000 goods and services, Everything from grain and wine to wages and transportation. Violating the edict could mean death. But laws can't force trust into money. When currency itself is worthless, no decree can save it. The result? A disaster. The black market exploded. Official trade collapsed, and everyday people quickly realized that no law could make a broken coin whole again. Eventually, the denarius was abandoned altogether. In its place, Emperor Constantine the Great introduced the solidus, a gold coin of consistent purity, around the year 312 after Christ. The solidus brought some stability and survived for centuries in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. But by then, the Western Empire had already been fatally weakened. The debasement of the denarius had hollowed out Rome's economic core. Armies could no longer be sustained, trade networks had dissolved, and most dangerous of all, the trust that bound the empire together was gone. So what does all of this mean for us today? The fall of Rome's currency isn't just dusty history, it's a warning. The destruction of money is always the destruction of empires. Rome thought it could trick its people by minting coins that looked the same, but carried less and less real value. And modern governments? They believe they can do the same by printing paper, inflating debts, and manipulating interest rates. But the outcome is always the same. The people pay the price, wealth evaporates, and trust collapses. History has shown this again and again. Take the 20th century. After World War I, Germany faced crushing reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. To cover its obligations, the government simply printed more marks, thinking it could paper over its debts, just as Rome had once struck more coins. By 1923, hyperinflation was raging. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark before the war soared to more than 200 billion marks by the fall of that year. Imagine earning your wages in the morning only to find they were worthless by nightfall. Ordinary Germans carted wages home in wheelbarrows, desperate to buy food before prices doubled again. Pensioners starved as their life savings, once secure, turned into dust. And just as in Rome, those who held debts found them wiped out, while those who owned real assets, land, factories, foreign currency, emerged stronger. Money itself became meaningless. And in the void left by economic despair, political extremism flourished. The stage was set for the rise of Adolf Hitler. Fast forward to the early 2000s in Zimbabwe. Facing land seizures, collapsing production, and mounting debts, the government once again turned to the printing press. By 2008, inflation reached a mind-bending annual rate of 89.7 sextillion%. Prices doubled every single day. Shopkeepers couldn't change price tags fast enough. People carried bags of bills worth trillions, only to find they could barely buy a loaf of bread. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency entirely, forcing citizens to trade in US dollars or South African rand. Once again, a government thought it could cheat reality, and once again the people paid the price. But here's the key. You don't even need hyperinflation to see Rome's pattern alive today. Even in developed economies, inflation works quietly, eating away at the value of money year after year. Consider the United States. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard, severing the final link between the dollar and any tangible anchor. From that moment on, the US dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed not by gold, not by silver, but by trust in the government itself. At first, the change seemed minor, but slowly, the temptation to spend beyond means became irresistible. Over the decades, government debt ballooned, the money supply expanded, and inflation became a permanent undercurrent of life. You don't see wheelbarrows full of cash in America, but you do see something subtler, the steady erosion of purchasing power. $1 in 1971 bought what takes more than $6 today. The bills look the same, the coins look the same, but the value has been hollowed out. And here's the trick that governments always play. They disguise inflation as prosperity. They tell citizens that rising wages mean progress, even when the cost of living rises faster than paychecks. They point to booming stock markets as proof of wealth, even though the majority of citizens own little or no stock at all. They present government borrowing as investment, even when much of it funds simple consumption. Just like the emperors of Rome, modern leaders pretend that nothing fundamental has changed while quietly extracting value from every coin, every bill, every paycheck. What makes today even more dangerous is the scale. Rome's collapse was an imperial crisis. Weimar Germany's was national, Zimbabwe's was local. But now, the entire world runs on fiat currencies, on mountains of debt, and on central banks willing to print trillions at the first sign of trouble. That means the next collapse won't be confined to a single country or empire, it will ripple across the globe. And if history is any guide, the people who will suffer most won't be the elites. They hold land, businesses, and real assets that keep their value. The ones who will suffer are ordinary citizens, people with salaries, pensions, and savings denominated in increasingly fragile currencies. So what lessons can we take from Rome's currency crisis? First, understand that inflation is not an accident. It is policy. It is the silent tax that has broken empires for 2,000 years. Second, real wealth is not paper or digits on a screen. Real wealth is land, skills, productive businesses, resources, things that retain value when money itself crumbles. And third, never assume stability is permanent. Romans in the 1st century after Christ would have laughed if you told them their coins would one day be worthless. Germans in 1913 would have scoffed at the idea of pushing wages home in wheelbarrows. Zimbabweans in the 1980s believed independence promised prosperity. Yet in each case, the same story unfolded. The fall of Rome reminds us that financial systems can unravel slowly and then all at once. When money ceases to be real, society itself begins to collapse. Contracts fail, trade breaks down, armies disband, governments lose legitimacy. And while foreign invaders or barbarians at the gate may finish the job, the true killer is almost always inside the treasury. History doesn't repeat in exact detail, but it rhymes. Ignore the lessons, and the rhyme becomes a crushing echo. Rome's currency crisis wasn't only about corrupt emperors or greedy elites. It was about the inherent fragility of money when it's abused by those in power, and that fragility has never disappeared. Which brings us to today. Look around. Governments across the globe are drowning in debt, printing more money, and reassuring their citizens that everything is under control. But history whispers a different story. Rome thought it was eternal. Its people thought the denarius would always hold value. They were wrong. And unless we learn from them, so are we. To really grasp the danger, let's step back and think about what money actually is. At its core, money is not just paper, coins, or digital numbers on a screen. Money is trust. It's the belief that when you hand over a coin or a bill or swipe a card, the other person will accept it in exchange for goods or services. That belief is fragile. Once lost, the very fabric of society begins to tear apart. Rome's people lost faith in the denarius when they realized it was no longer silver. Germans lost faith in the mark when their life savings couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Zimbabweans lost faith in their dollar when prices doubled every day. And when trust is gone, money is gone. But here's the thing. Elites always find a way to protect themselves. In Rome, the wealthy hoarded gold, land, and slaves' assets that still had value when coins collapsed. In Weimar Germany, industrialists bought foreign currency and built factories. In Zimbabwe, those with connections moved wealth into dollars, land, or cattle. The pattern is cruel but consistent. Governments debase money to cover their debts, elites shield themselves, and ordinary people are left holding worthless paper. Now think about our world today. For decades, central banks have promised stability. Yet debt levels climb higher every year, and money printing has become the first solution to every crisis. When banks fail, when wars erupt, when pandemics spread, the printing presses roar to life. Trillions of new dollars, euros, yen, and yuan flood into the system. And just like Rome's denarius, those units of money look the same as before, but they are worth less. Here's a sobering fact. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost over 80% of its purchasing power. A single dollar today buys only a fraction of what it did half a century ago. Think about housing, healthcare, education. Food prices have soared while wages limp behind. This isn't an accident. It's policy. It's the silent tax of inflation, slowly eroding wealth while leaders pretend it's all under control. And it isn't just the United States. Across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, currencies have weakened decade after decade. People work harder, save diligently, and still find themselves falling behind. Just like Rome, governments distract citizens with spectacles, sports, entertainment, political theater, while the currency that underpins their lives is hollowed out. What makes this even more alarming is the interconnected nature of today's world. In Rome's time, a collapsing currency hurt one empire. In Weimar's time, it wrecked one nation. But today, the entire global system runs on fiat money, on digital numbers backed by nothing more than promises. If trust in that system fails, it won't be one empire or one country that falls. It could be the entire global economy. And here's the brutal truth. History suggests that collapse is not a question of if, but when. Because no empire, no nation, has ever been able to endlessly debase its currency and escape the consequences. Rome thought it could. Germany thought it could. Zimbabwe thought it could. And all of them paid the price. Let's dig deeper into how collapse actually unfolds. It rarely happens overnight. At first, it's subtle. A coin loses a little silver. A loaf of bread costs a little more. People grumble, but they adjust. Governments reassure them that everything is fine, that inflation is temporary or under control. Life goes on. Then the cracks widen. Prices rise faster. Wages can't keep up. The middle class begins to shrink. Those who worked hard and saved all their lives discover that their savings buy less every year. Ordinary families start cutting back, not on luxuries, but on essentials. Meat disappears from the table. New clothes are postponed. Repairs to homes or farms are delayed. In Rome, this meant soldiers demanding more pay, farmers abandoning fields, and merchants refusing debased coins. In modern times, it means rising rent, medical bills that swallow incomes, and young generations locked out of housing markets. Different eras, same story. Eventually, the crisis becomes impossible to hide. Confidence evaporates. People rush to convert their money into anything that seems safer: gold, foreign currency, food, even durable goods like tools or livestock. Black markets explode because people no longer trust official prices or official money. Governments, desperate to maintain control, pass harsher laws. In Rome, Diocletian tried to fix prices by decree, even threatening death to violators. In Weimar Germany, authorities tried to outlaw foreign currency trades. In Zimbabwe, they threatened shopkeepers who refused to accept their collapsing dollars. None of it worked. Because here's the truth. No law can force people to believe in worthless money. And this is where the real unraveling begins. When money dies, contracts collapse. Credit disappears. Farmers won't plant if they don't trust they'll be paid. Merchants won't trade if they fear their coins will be worthless tomorrow. Armies won't fight if their wages won't feed their families. And governments lose legitimacy when they can no longer provide stability. Rome's decline shows this perfectly. The denarius had once been the glue that held the empire together, uniting soldiers, farmers, merchants, and citizens across thousands of miles. When that glue dissolved, the empire fragmented, trade routes broke down, local economies turned inward. Soldiers became mercenaries loyal to whoever could pay them in real value. The empire's borders crumbled not only because of barbarian attacks, but because its economic core was hollow. And this is exactly why inflation is so dangerous. It doesn't just raise prices, it erodes trust, the single most important foundation of any civilization. Without trust in money, people stop cooperating. They stop trading. They stop building for the future. They retreat into survival mode. That's why inflation has destroyed not only Rome, but countless nations across history. And it's why ignoring the warning signs today is so reckless. Because just like Rome's citizens, many modern people laugh at the idea that their money could ever fail. The dollar will always be strong, they say. The euro will always be stable. Romans once said the same about the denarius. And here's the irony. Collapses often seem impossible right up until the moment they happen. In the year 200 after Christ, no Roman would have believed that within just a few generations, their mighty empire would fracture and fade. In 1913, Germans laughed at the idea that their money could one day require wheelbarrows to carry. In Zimbabwe in the 1980s, people celebrated independence and imagined prosperity, not trillion-dollar notes. But collapse doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It creeps in slowly, then suddenly everything breaks at once. That's why Rome's story is not just ancient history, it's a blueprint, a reminder that money is fragile, and when abused, it can take entire civilizations down with it. So what should we, as individuals, take away from Rome's lesson? First, understand that inflation is not a mistake. It is deliberate policy. Governments always prefer the hidden tax of inflation over the open revolt caused by higher direct taxes. By debasing the currency, they extract value quietly, year after year, hoping most people won't notice. Second, real wealth is not paper or digits on a screen. Real wealth is what sustains life and holds value when money does not land: resources, skills, businesses, and relationships. These are the things that survive when currencies collapse. Romans who held land and gold endured. Germans who owned factories and foreign accounts survived. Zimbabweans who owned cattle or foreign currency managed to keep going. Everyone else was crushed. Third, never confuse stability with permanence. The Romans in the 1st century thought their empire was eternal. The Americans in the mid-20th century thought the dollar would always rule. The Europeans who created the euro believed they had solved the problem of unstable currencies forever. But history teaches humility. No money is too sacred to fail, because when money stops being real, society begins to unravel. Promises are broken, contracts are meaningless, armies disband, governments lose legitimacy. And in the end, the true enemy is not at the gate, but inside the treasury. And maybe that's the final and most important point. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. Ignore its lessons and you will hear the same rhyme echo again, only louder. Rome's collapse wasn't about a single bad emperor or one greedy elite. It was about the fragile nature of money itself when those in power abuse it. And that lesson has never gone away. So, the next time you hear a politician or central banker say that debt doesn't matter, that inflation is under control, or that money printing has no consequences, remember Rome. Remember the Denarius that once held an empire together and then became worthless bronze. Remember the farmers who abandoned their land, the soldiers who deserted, and the citizens who lost everything they had. Because history whispers a warning: destroy the money and you destroy the empire. Rome learned it the hard way. If we fail to learn, so will we. And if this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. And hey, if you're still curious about how empires rise and fall, I've got another video right here that will take you even deeper. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. Remember, we are the ones who remember, the ones who question, the ones who refuse to bow to the silence of history. And you, are you ready for the next secret of Rome?